food from inside. We're super lucky today to have a bunch of delicious food sourced by Food Not Bombs, so really grateful for that. So I'm here this afternoon to share, or at least four amazing people share their story on the importance of building climate-resilient communities. So we know the importance of community in our daily lives, but that importance is even increasingly so, especially moving in the future with the increasing impacts of climate change. So the first person that I'd like to introduce is Carmen Lahiff-Jenkins. Carmen is a dedicated climate advocate, currently serving as the climate justice coordinator for the Darebin Neighbourhood House Network. Currently specializing in the challenges posed by heat waves, Carmen focuses on developing practical, community-based adaptation strategies and gathering academic research on adaptation models. Carmen works directly with vulnerable communities to craft actionable solutions and deliver vital education, ensuring that the impacts of extreme weather events are met with informed, locally driven responses. On behalf of the Darebin Neighbourhood House Network, Carmen champions environmental justice by empowering communities to take charge of their climate futures. Through hands-on initiatives, educational workshops, and public engagement, she works towards collective action and fosters a deep understanding of the need for sustainable, inclusive solutions. Carmen, thank you for being here with us today.
Wow, it feels a lot like that memory. So, 2009-2014, we had two massive heat waves hit Mullum, which were defined by the bomb as extreme heat waves. And those heat waves killed over 500 people just in Singapore. And that is 500 people directly attributable to the heat wave effect. So when we're looking at community houses, such as I work, which is I work in a Darebin Neighbourhood House Network, what we're looking at is we're looking at spaces where communities gather, in particular vulnerable communities. So we were funded by the World Medicine Foundation to have a look at what we could do, what neighbourhood houses could do in the event of heat waves to protect communities. And unfortunately, there were some ideas about what neighbourhood houses could do, and we hoped those ideas would be that neighbourhood houses could host cooling centres, and those cooling centres would offer places of refuge to people in the heat. And that sounds good and intuitive and just right. But I've been working now on this project for over a year, and in actual fact, the community don't want that. They don't want to leave their homes when there's a heat wave. They don't want to work out ways to travel to a neighbourhood house when there's a heat wave. They don't want to go home at 5 or 6 o'clock when neighbourhood houses are no longer running because they're closed, the doors closed, because often that's a really hot time of day. So what do they want? So what we did is we ran a survey at Northland. I've done many things, but one of the things we did was run a survey at Northland. And when we ran the survey at Northland, I started with the question, would you seek shelter in a neighbourhood house if it was very, very hot? And I had one woman say to me, when it's very, very hot, I go to the beach. And I said, in an extreme heat wave, I go to the beach and you can't stop me. Why do people want to stop us going to the beach? And I said, holy shit, I'm asking the wrong question. So we quickly pivoted, and what we started to say was, do you know what a heat wave is? And people said, no. And one woman said, it's a great time for me to tan. I really love tanning. And I was like, holy shit, we are asking the wrong questions and we've got the wrong focus. The reality is, a lot of people in the community don't even realise that a heat wave is a severe incident. And the origins of neighbourhood houses is feminism. Where neighbourhood houses started around the concept of gathering groups of women together to understand our disempowerment and find ways to be empowered within that. So what I've done is we've started to look back to those original frameworks in neighbourhood houses and recognise we have to bring our communities with us so they understand what a heat wave is. So we're really starting at brass tacks. And government doesn't call heat waves emergencies, and there's some really complex and very financial, would you believe, reasons why they don't do that. They probably won't ever do it. And because of that, there won't be emergency centres set up, etc. They'll push it back onto the community. We've got to deal with all those things. There's a lot of projects going on across the whole state. What we're focusing on now in the Neighbourhood House Network is to actually offer people education and frameworks to understand how they can retrofit their house and how they can make it safe for themselves to survive climate change, and what that might look like for all of the different people. And people in the audience might ask, but what about vulnerable community members? What happens to vulnerable community members? But I would challenge you and say every single person you've ever met is extremely vulnerable to climate change, and they're extremely vulnerable to heat waves. And because of that vulnerability, we can't just look at this idea, there's just this vulnerable group over here that needs some help, but the rest of us will all be fine. I'm living with some really severe health conditions, and they're really new and recent to me, and all of a sudden these questions have become, what am I going to do in a heat wave, and who is going to protect me? And when I started asking the people at neighbourhood houses who worked in neighbourhood houses, many volunteers work in neighbourhood houses, often they're older people, what will you do in a heat wave? They said, I can't come to a neighbourhood house in a heat wave and look after other people here who may not want to be here because it's not, the community's told me they don't want it. So there's a lot of frameworks here to think about and about how we build community in those circumstances. And we go back to the work that Jack, who's at the back of the room, big legend in this space. Hi Jack, shout out. Jack did a lot of work with the Jesuits, and what they did is they found that if you are a community member, they found this, so it's also reinforcing some other data. If you are a community member and you are disconnected from community, you are much more likely to die in a climate event or in a heat wave. And if you are very connected to community, you're much more likely to survive a heat wave or a community event. Because community power, community connection, and our relationships are actually what keep us safe in climate change. And that is what Neighbourhood Houses' core business is, and what we'll continue to do with our communities to make sure people are connected and safe.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I think we could all agree with what you said, the importance of community. I would like to pass it over to Elena Pereyra. Elena is a previous board member and chair of Cohousing Australia. She's currently doing a PhD on housing as an urban commons. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you. That's a great segue because I'm going to talk a bit about co-housing. But first, just to talk about, I'm interested in the interaction of social capital and the evolution of social cultures, but how that is really being decimated by capital and finance, and that's what we see in the production of housing. And co-housing was also started by feminists and people coming together to create more socially cohered ways of living together. And instead what we've done here is create a huge amount of urban sprawl and also a huge amount of vertical sprawl, and which really disconnects people from those networks. And we've developed the entire housing model around finance and enclosure. And we've got houses scattered, and they get bigger and bigger with isolated amenities, so rumpus rooms, and en-suites and appliances, so that you don't actually need to go and meet people and connect. Your housing informs you that you need to live a highly isolated and disconnected life. And we've done the same thing from a vertical perspective. I mean, they're literally called apartments, and we've created the Owners Corp, which couldn't be more boring and elitist if it tried. And whereas I think that actually that could be a mechanism of the kind of fourth level of governance and social connection, but that's not what it's used for at all. It's used to create rules and conditions around how you're meant to live and stay, hopefully, as separated as possible. And but there's a lot of things that we need to do, especially in the housing space, a lot focused around affordability. But to me, if all we address is the issue of affordability, we actually miss the opportunity to do so much more. in terms of designing better for climate and resilience, and also for isolation and social connection. And we know that if we do that, then we build enormous capacity to weather some of the other things that we know come up for us personally and as a whole collective. So co-housing is a model, as I said, that started with feminists in Europe in the 60s and 70s, and there are some, is that the bell for me? And there are some key attributes, and part of it is co-design. The projects are initiated by groups of people coming together. They're co-designed so that you can establish the amenities and facilities that are going to support you and your life and your goals and your community. They typically focus on more sustainability, technology and design, because they're not being built as the developer model to maximise profits and just kind of sell as many as you can. And often those things are value managed out of the project because the benefits are only seen when you live in the project, not when you sell it up front. So you can design better, but then you can also have smaller dwellings that have living, kitchen, bathrooms, bedrooms, but you don't need to have the guest bedroom, the space for yoga or art or working. All of those things can be provided if they're co-located within your cluster of 30 dwellings or so, and so you can have access to them. There's typically a common house that has a large kitchen and dining space, and that's really important for bringing community together regularly so that they have meals together. You build that social relationality, but then it also means you talk about the things that are challenging, but also the things that you're excited about. And so they can become hotbeds for other ideas and basically act as informal neighbourhood houses within communities. And you can share things like electric vehicles, mowers, washing machines, guest bedrooms. So that means you also don't need to privately own a whole bunch of infrastructure, which is completely unnecessary. But what we've done in the ordinary housing market is basically create a commodity to fill with commodities. We've displaced a bunch of people from their social networks, and so they're not connected and talking to each other, but they are seeing the success, so-called, of everybody else's accumulation. We literally couldn't do it worse, but there's so much we can do if we change the model. Thank you.
That apartment comment really was like a mind-blown moment. Our next speaker, Sasha Mainsbridge, absolutely knows what it's like to work with developers and her own story of developing her house. Sasha is the founder and president of Mullum Cares, a nonprofit organization that focuses on resource conservation. Here, Sasha uses her experience and knowledge to help her community become more climate resilient. She's an advocate for building back better after floods. Thank you for being with us, Sasha.
Thanks for having me. I've flown down from Melbourne, New South Wales, because I know that everybody in this room is an advocate for climate action, and so I need all of you guys to help me keep front of mind. There's over 200,000 homes in Melbourne, according to Melbourne Water's website, that are at risk of flooding, but apparently only 4% of the homeowners are aware of that. So they're not here today, and they won't go to a workshop if I try and run one to help them understand what the challenge is going to be when their home floods. So you guys are going to have to be the champions for me, because my experience in Mullum, my home flooded in February 2022. I moved to Mullum from Melbourne thinking that something magical was happening in Mullum. I kept hearing that it was the place to be, to work on climate mitigation, and I wish I hadn't left, to be honest. I feel like a lot more has happened in Melbourne. But the experience that I had that is still consistent, and I've heard some really harrowing stories of residents who went through the Darebin flood in 2022 that sound even worse than what my community went through. But the crux of the message I want you to understand is that most insurers' policy will put you back the way you were. It's called like for like. So when you flood, everything that gets thrown out of the nature strip, when you see on the news the piles of stuff, it's carpet, it's the walls, it's the kitchen cabinetry gets thrown out, it's the whole bathrooms get ripped out. Even if you have that much water through your house, they'll rip out the kitchens and all the bathrooms. And most people who go through that are out of their home for at least 12 months. Most of my neighbours were out of their home for 2 years. Some of them were driving their children to primary school for over an hour because that's how far they had to go to get housing. So you can imagine there's no housing for the tradies that needed to come to the area to help us rebuild our homes. And all the insurers were just putting houses back the way they were before, so all of those homes are just set to go through that whole thing again. It doesn't matter to me whether it happens in 2 years or 20. When it happens again, the people living in those homes are going to go through that all over again. But there is an alternative, and every state has documents to teach you how to do it. So this is Melbourne Water's Guide to Flood Resilient Retrofitting. It's sitting on their website. But I guarantee you that when a flood comes through, no one's going to know it's there, because that's what happened to me. I quickly found out what I could do. I had an organisation called Mullum Cares Incorporated. Our purpose is to help people avoid predictable waste. So we've been working on coffee cups and plastic bags and all that crap, right? And so we were doing a textile conservation project. The flood came through and I said, okay, see the nature strips? There you go. There's predictable waste. So what can we do? We pivoted and we opened a shipping container office. We had Queensland's Flood Resilient Guide and we had this. This has been published since 2019. And we just invited our community to come and get the information. I can't give technical advice. I don't know exactly what your house is like, but here you go. If you can ask your insurer to help you build back better, great, but most of them are going to say no. And then what you can do is you can ask for a cash settlement. Now you've got to have some guts to do this because you kind of go in it alone. It's hard to find a builder, it's hard to get tradies, when there's hardly any around. But I think at this point now, every state has got these documents on flood resilient retrofitting. You should call on the state government to help you. And you should be able to get the trades. If you can't, you just call James Davidson. He's the architect in Brisbane whose name is on all of these documents. And when I rang him just as a resident to say, what can I do? He gave me 3 hours on the phone and he sent me links. And then what he started doing was setting up free half-hour consultations on Zoom for anybody in my community that wanted his help. So the help is out there, and I was lucky enough to be able to take the money from my insurer, rebuild my home resilient, and so we were out of the house for 13 months, so even with all my connections and my know-how, it still took that long. But now my guesstimate based on the plan is I've rented the house out because I had to move my teenagers out of the flood zone because they just couldn't cope with the thought of going through it again. But my tenants know exactly what's going to happen and that they will need to live elsewhere rent-free for up to 2 weeks and then they'll be back. So that's the difference. So we've got a housing crisis and we need to secure safe housing. And flood zones are going to have damaged houses and they are going to get put back the way they were before unless people understand that there's an alternative. So I'll leave it with you. It'd be great if you flood or anyone you know, let them know. Head straight to Melbourne Water for information on rebuilding and building back better.
Thank you so much, Sasha. Yeah, it's so important that we help educate and empower the people within our community. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Anitra Nelson, who's part of the Degrowth Network. Anitra is a community-based activist scholar, a member of Degrowth Network Australia, Degrowth Central Victoria, and the University of Melbourne Informal Urbanism Research Hub. Thank you, Anitra.
It's great to be here today to talk about degrowth, resilience and disasters. Degrowth identifies as a key issue growth, economies and cultures, sacrificing ecological and social concerns to growing markets, trade, companies and money. So the degrowth movement developed to address ecological unsustainabilities, out of control carbon emissions, just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the disasters we face, in fact, are unnatural disasters. Climate change is largely a result of the way that we live. Extracting from and damaging landscapes and people are central to market economies and growth, where inequity and exploitation are both central. So, along with living one planet footprints, degrowth addresses political and material inequalities and poverty, arguing for community-based decision-making. Melbourne's West is really familiar with unnatural disasters and inequalities, with floods and fires, difficulties with housing and food, industrial pollution in the air and waters. Our Prime Minister recently associated resilience with strength. Degrowth activists see resilience as resurgence. In other words, changing our everyday practices as we work in solidarity. We're not about strength as simply putting up with stuff. We want system change. Working towards harmony, sharing and caring, changing our relationships with Earth and with one another through strengthening localised decision-making and collective action. So what does that mean in practice? I used to live in the Bendigo Islands and the Blue Mountains, which both threatened with bushfire and occasionally floods. And there I learned a lot about community preparedness. Beyond joining fire brigades and preparing a household for a fire or flood, communities can get together in local streets and other networks to create phone trees, to decide what advocacy and campaigns they might pursue collectively, all the time pushing for a world that works more smoothly at the grassroots, that values the environment and respects our unique differences as well as our common concerns. At the Bendigo Islands, a phone tree started with a CFA volunteer who'd been informed that tomorrow there was a total fire ban. They rang 2 people and told them, and went on, and this network meant that within a couple of hours, everyone in the community was connected with at least a few other people who would know their circumstances and their whereabouts in the case of a calamity. In the Blue Mountains, the fire brigade issued every second street with a trailer of very simple and basic fire equipment. So any small fire could be addressed by locals even before the brigade got there. These kinds of community organising make us feel stronger. We had clear processes for organising to face disasters. Both communities had strong conservation and social organisations that lobbied politicians and did bush care to regenerate nature. Borderlands, the community gardens here, and so many activities are crucial for community organising. Advocating and campaigning are critical too. Instead of putting our taxes into freeways to airports, collective action is needed to make politicians address the horrendous insurance costs that people in areas threatened by flooding face, to prevent homes being built in vulnerable places, and to protect homes and sensitive environments that are vulnerable to flooding. Community, I believe, is really central to our resilience.
Thank you, Anitra. Yes, absolutely. Community is extremely vital and essential to our existence. So we're really glad to have so many of you here today as part of our community. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions that you might have for our panelists. I don't think so, but maybe. I think we're down to 2.
Okay.
We can make it work.
Maybe just a shout out.
Would anybody like to ask a question? Yeah.
Sorry, over to you.
Like a follow-up? So, can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is how these rooms are designed, I think. Maybe the concept of the 4th level of governance, I thought we had a little tweak at that. Just if people want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's part of a bigger disintegration, I think, of our capacity to participate in democracy and governance. And it's a breakdown of trust amongst community, but also an assumption that community can't work together. And we see that, I mean, you can see it online and you can see it in our personal relationships that you're sort of not meant to talk about money and religion and all of those sorts of things. But now we can't even talk about the weather, because as soon as you go, oh, it's quite hot, it's going to be a tricky conversation. But actually we need more and more spaces where we have to rub up against one another and realise that actually there's much more that ties us together than keeps us apart. And I don't think the political institutions that we have do not, I mean, if you watch Question Time, you kind of go, wow, is this the epitome of democracy? Horrible, it is horrible. But I think actually if you look at citizens' assemblies and citizen panels and juries and places like this where people can come together and talk about the issues that affect them and how they would like to see them be addressed, then that is where you get an opportunity of mutual care and support. And disasters are terrible, but actually in those moments, that's when you get the greatest satisfaction and sense of connection, unfortunately. So it's important that we use those opportunities to connect people and build capacity rather than exhaust people and have them stuck in the bureaucracy of trying to chase their insurance company. But also, there are some communities, which I was going to reflect on both of what you were talking about, that when a fire comes through or a flood comes through, they would actually like to pool their resources, pool their payouts, and design and develop co-housing and things like that, so we can build back differently in ways that also help us co-govern more effectively. And yeah, the owners corp is not working. But those buildings also need to retrofit, get off gas, do a whole lot of things. So governments who could empower owners corps and whatever infrastructure we do have to have a different approach would be enormously beneficial.
Also, citizens' assemblies, as in that 4th layer of government, are already in place. People are acting those. We've had them running in Darebin, and I can't remember for life of me what the issues were, but they were these fantastic scenarios where you had 150 community members, and I think in the end people got paid and people were engaged. They did the research, they worked together, and they came with these ultimate decisions, and that's happening in more progressive and radical councils. You're starting to get that.
Oh, it's in the Local Government Act. I think all councils need to do
It
something.
is, yes, I thought it was.
Yeah, well, where I'm, my community organisation has a seat at the table with the Byron Shire Council in an advisory committee. So I do think part of like stretching governance outside of the 3 tiers, there is an argument that you kind of try and play the game as well. So find out what is actually available through councils, because they are popping up. Because you want to have that in. The other thing I think is worth always considering is, after a disaster, money flows, so be ready, right? So if you've got a community organisation, be ready with your ask, because, you want to make hay while the sun's shining right there. So I've got friends and I've worked for Resilient UK, so they were ready, and they pretty much put in 300 grand, right? Now they've got no funding for ongoing staff costs, but they've got a ton of assets now. So, and I also noticed that through FRRR, if anyone here has got a community organisation, they've just announced a partnership with Suncorp. So there is money available for community groups right now that were affected by any recent, like any disaster in the last 5 years. You can apply for funding, which might be a PR stunt by Suncorp, but they're giving away some money, so money's good.
Great, thank you. Let's go to the very back. Would you like the microphone?
I think I've had enough of people. First of all, I just wanted to congratulate Darebin on being the first council to actually endorse the plant-based treaty and taking a step forward there and being a leader for other councils in Melbourne. Hopefully the rest of the country will follow suit as well. My question is, you did touch a little bit on vulnerability in vulnerable communities, and whilst I do agree that everyone is vulnerable, it's also statistically true that those with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by heat impacts and climate change in general. I also agree that most councils have taken the attitude of we'll just have a opening up our libraries, or we'll just create these centres on the assumption that people can get to them in the first place, which for many people, they don't have access to adequate public transport or anything else like that to get to these places. So whilst it's a nice idea, it doesn't go far enough. This is an issue that I have raised personally with my local council in Brisbane, and something I've had a lot of pushback from, including from the directors within council, who seem to think that their way is the only way and that they will tell us what they will do rather than the community concern. What would be your advice from a grassroots level, trying to actively engage with our councils and actually trying to convince them that this is actually the right thing to do? And the second part to my question is also there was a mention of having a registry of such to actually coordinate services, and something that I've also advocated for is having a voluntary register where people who are vulnerable and are unable to actually evacuate in an emergency could be contacted to ensure that they can actually get out if not someone can actually assist them. So that is something we also try to do, and I'd love for other councils to also implement something that and be better at the state level. But how would you actually push and try and convince councils that these are the actions that they need to take at a local level, rather than constantly blaming the state and federal government and saying it's their problem to solve and not theirs?
Look, these are really great points. I certainly don't work for the council, but I do try and work closely with them, and it is a really hard slog because they have very specific ways of doing things that are very bureaucratic, that are very slow, which is one of the reasons why Neighbourhood Houses was looking at can we be cooling centres, because we can pivot like that and council just cannot pivot. And when there's a disaster, council can't pivot. Community will pivot, council just, we've got a path, this is the way we're going to do it. A fantastic example of that is that I was doing some door knocking last year. My husband and I door knocked, and we door knocked about 3,500 houses maybe. And we spoke to people, and I was actually just running for local council. But what would happen was, because I work for Neighbourhood Houses and Services, I'd knock on a door and I'd say I'm running for local council, and so many people would say, "Oh, you're with the council because I've got this thing I need help with." And I'd say, I'm not with the council, but I can help you because I'm in Neighbourhood Houses. And so I ended up getting lists and streams of information to all these different services. And some of the things I found out was that, and then council loved it. Anyway, they went, that's so great, we had such impact, we're going to do the same thing. And I said, that's amazing. And they said, we're going to go and knock on doors and we're going to tell people about heat. And I was like, oh my God, that's incredible. How many doors are you going to knock on? And they said, we're going to knock on 150. And I said, I'm joking. And it just felt really sad and ineffective. So working with local council, I suspect they just fill a very specific role, and they have told me time and time again, we are here to help you, but it's not our job to run a cooling centre. And I'm like, oh no, it is actually your job. It is not our job, because we are volunteers and we are community. You have to run the cooling centre. So they write all this stuff and send people to us, and we write all this stuff and say send people to your libraries. And the great thing about Darebin is they've extended their hours, people can go to libraries for a lot longer, that's really fantastic. And the libraries are well used and understood as cooling centre spaces. So that's a good thing, and it's great, and Darebin's being forced to take responsibility for that, and they are. But there's lots of other stuff that council can't do that services do. and the services work beautifully together. In fact, public housing, for all their faults, my God, there are many, but for public housing, they do have a list of vulnerable people that they contact. They've got a text list, and they text vulnerable people, this is what's happening, there's an emergency, there's, weather, but only if we tell them to. That's when they sort of do it. And they'll also listen to us. So the services in Darebin specifically, which I know of, we have diverse, we have the churches, we all meet together about once every couple of months and also kind of connect with each other and work out who's doing what for who and how, who can do this, who can do that. So we're kind of working all together, but it's always services. And council do things like, we'll hire the hall for you, but no one can show up from council because we're busy. It's just like, okay. So I'm not sure how we get councils on board. We get them to give us money is the best I think we can do. Councils are really behind. They want to fund research. They want to do those sorts of things. But those on the ground, what's happening, people need help today. Because, the stuff where you're getting called to an emergency is very different to heat wave. When you've got a heat wave, it's no emergency. People get, there's an extreme heat warning. You don't get any recovery opportunity afterwards. And the lack of recovery opportunity is a real problem in heat waves. There's no money being thrown at heat waves or given to us for heat waves. And this is a whole other agenda. It's funny because when you go to councils, they say, we're really starting to talk about this now. Well, like there were massive heat waves in 2014, 2009, where 500 people died. Where were you then? So, yeah, I'm not sure. It basically is about mine.
I just quickly wanted to say it's worth looking to Lismore because Lismore have evacuation plans, particularly for vulnerable people. And I was talking to a friend who's trying to get evacuation plans done for the Byron Shire for my neighbourhoods. And she told me that it looks like the only way she's going to achieve that is by, she wants evacuation plans for everybody, but where there seems to be leverage is going in and saying, vulnerable people who have special needs, they are at greater risk, so they need an evacuation plan. But I've looked at Lismore because they had a big disaster. They've achieved a lot and they've got full evacuation plans. Their vulnerable people are being very well looked after in terms of that planning. The other thing, I don't know if this is worth saying, but I know my own organisation tried to help start a vulnerable persons register, voluntary, and most of the people that were coming to our meetings were just really quite concerned and scared about their information leaking.
Yeah.
So we that died, the whole idea died in the water, as an experience.
Yes, I live in Mount Alexander Shire, and when my partner had motor neuron disease, he's died now, but I contacted the local council because they said they had a vulnerable persons list. But all that meant was that they'd tell us when there was going to be a total fire ban or there was some flooding event, and we still had to do something about it. And if you've actually just got an ordinary car, you can't get a paralysed person into it. And if you think about the number of ambulances that would be operating in some kind of disaster, it seems to me that it's almost impossible for top-down to work. And I think that we actually have to be working together. And caring for people, there's about 1 in 4 people in Australia require some kind of assistance with everyday living. And I think that we actually, as obligations to our neighbours, we actually need to be doing a lot more co-caring. And that this is probably about the only way that we're going to get through the next 10 years. We're going to be seeing multiple disasters that we would never imagine. We really need to be cooperating with one another and mindful and thinking ahead. I just don't think governments have got the capacity to do it.
Thank you so much, Carmen, Elena, Anitra, and Sasha. It's been a pleasure hearing your stories and your experience and knowledge. Thank you so much. The next panel we have up in about 5 minutes, I believe, is the climate impacts at work. So stick around for that. Thank you.
Thank you.